So it would be Brexit, Brexit, Brexit at a certain point in our conversation, I should think, but I'm going to try and do it a little bit broader than that. Apparently this is also not merely the place of great chemistry and physics experiments, it's also the place of where they used to dissect bodies. So, yeah, Richard, I thought it was actually really interesting, your presentation. The employer being the most trusted, I can understand. And I suppose at least you can't replace a prime minister with a robot. So, anyway, I'm now going to talk a little bit more generally. The results from this year's Trust Barometer are stark but unsurprising. Brexit is defining, fraught, and overwhelming. But even if we strip Brexit out of the findings, politics has a problem and has had for some time. I want to make 2 points which are somewhat counterintuitive. First, that it is the character of the debate and not the character of politicians which drives distrust. You may not be surprised at that. And the confusion of the two creates a distortion of focus. And in this climate, the justifiable desire for change, which the barometer shows, opens the door to populism of right and left, with politicians promising radical and divisive solutions, whether or not those solutions are wise or practical, and therefore with the consequence of a large part of the population feeling unrepresented. These are not the traditional ways of looking at the trust issue. The traditional way is that politicians routinely lie and deceive, and that's the problem. The truth is, at least until recently, politicians are like any other subsection of the population, and they lie and deceive no more today than they ever did. They're the same mix of ambition, anxiety, and principle which characterizes most people. The majority of Parliament, believe it or not, come into politics to try and effect change in accordance with their convictions. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. Sometimes in succeeding they overreach, and sometimes in failing they cut corners. Misdiagnose the problem, however, and you end up where we are, with leadership that is either followership or populist. One group chases public opinion, the other takes a part of it and turns it into a narrative of division and betrayal. It is actually the character of the debate that is changing. Conventional media is fragmenting, with a commercial model upended by technology, and therefore increasingly believing that its only mode of survival is to take a constituency of people and keep them in a permanent state of anger and grievance. Both sides of the Atlantic, we see the same thing: pro-Trump, anti-Trump, pro-Brexit, anti-Brexit. Social media, itself a revolutionary phenomenon, then amplifies this tendency. Now, social media carries many benefits, but in politics, it is too frequently the medium of the loudmouth. Instant opinions unrelated to depth of knowledge, and yet expressed with all the certainty of the true fanatic, accompanied by vicious denunciation of those who disagree. You know, about the first lesson you learn in political leadership is that those who shout loudest don't necessarily deserve to be heard most. That's not how social media works. This is helping create a politics which is polarizing and partisan. It also allows the takeover of established political parties by groups large enough to mount such a capture, even if they don't represent a large proportion of the population. Conspiracy theories thrive. The center ground gets squeezed, the extremes flourish, and the choices for the public narrow. In the last decade, this revolution in media has coincided with a second thing, which is a completely legitimate desire for change, particularly following the financial crisis of 2008-9, but also influenced, as Richard was saying, by the pressures of globalization, not least mass migration. Stagnating incomes, at least for a significant section of the population, growing anger at widening inequality that, thanks to new media, we now perceive so vividly, insecurity, which is inevitable given the scope and scale of change, and a palpable sense among some communities that they've been ignored and left behind mean that this desire for change then manifests itself in calls for radical action. And the coming tech revolution will only intensify these concerns. But here's the challenge. What sort of change and what sort of radical action? The real radical action required is in reforming systems, including government, changing work practices, a vast reprioritizing of education and infrastructure. But all of these, in turn, require difficult and unpopular political decisions. They mean painstaking attention to detail, an understanding of how the modern world functions, a willingness to engage people, sometimes with unpalatable, even if necessary, choices. And this challenge isn't born of political failure, but of change beyond the politician's control. The easy thing, therefore, politically in these circumstances, is to pretend that all of this challenge is the result of perfidy and treachery by the political class, and the solutions are those which appeal to people's emotions, not to rational analysis. Hence the election of President Trump, hence Brexit. Look around the world today, and this populism is the new normal. For an optimist, I have to say right now I'm somewhat pessimistic about the near term. We may have to experience this populism to realize finally its limitations. But two things, however, I believe will help us shorten the experience. First, we should start the debate about the way information is exchanged and used in the modern media age. Democracy cannot function properly if access to information is being abused improperly. This is not just about the so-called fake news, but about the reliability and integrity of news media. This debate is urgent and concerns the conventional as well as social media. Secondly, I believe we need to revive a muscular center ground in politics. And by muscular, I mean one capable of accepting that behind the populist appeal lie genuine issues which must be addressed. For example, Brexit and the issue of immigration. And it has to be one that is prepared to seek radical solutions in response to the desire for change, but which are nonetheless based on evidence. In this, I would say handling the coming tech revolution is the top priority. But actually, it's virtually absent from the mainstream political debate right now. Both of these things will require true leadership. And here, in conclusion, there's a paradox in politics today. The media environment, which is pretty harsh, buffets politicians and makes them scared of leading. Yet at the same time, paradoxically, the public has a longing for leadership which stands its ground. This is the appeal, often underestimated, of what is sometimes referred to as the strongman leader. The center ground, in my view, needs the revival of leadership, which is strong, but has a unifying economic and social message, which puts forward radical solutions which are nonetheless reasonable and evidence-based. Long term, I believe this is the only way to re-establish trust. So, in my judgment, if we want to change the perceptions of mistrust, we must first change the debate around the concept of trust. Otherwise, I fear this famed barometer will only register decline. Thank you.